Before her face was molded in wax and her body buried in an unmarked pit, France arranged a public scene of humiliation for its queen. But it was not only an execution. It was a carefully planned act, where every movement of the guards, every detail of her clothing, and even the last strand of her hair carried a hidden meaning. She was forced to go through situations that seemed too cruel even for her enemies. Not only was the queen taken out of her chamber, but also the mother, who lost what was most precious to her. In the accusations, things were said so scandalous that even her furious opponents kept silent in the courtroom. She had to listen to words that no one could ever forgive. And all of it was done to destroy not only her body but also her name. Yet at the moment when it seemed that humiliation had reached its limit, she did something that astonished even the executioner. One short gesture, one simple phrase, and the crowd began to see her differently. Those words outlasted the revolution and became a legend that people still remember. Why was she refused solitude even in her most personal request? Why did an artist secretly paint her in her last moments? What secret hides behind the wax image of her face? And how did the most terrible accusations become her moment of strength? Stay with us until the end, for it was in her last hours that the secret was hidden that made Marie Antoinette immortal. Before the drums rumbled and the wheels of the carts creaked, everything had already been decided. The one who once shone in the golden halls of Versailles was turned into a nameless prisoner marked with the number 280. The contrast was striking, as if her entire life had been turned upside down in one night. Where once she was surrounded by mirrors, crystal, and fans, now there were only stone walls. A gloomy Parisian fortress called the prison of the Guillotine. In a cell filled with dampness, where rats peeked from the cracks and water dripped from the ceiling, she received a place no larger than a prison niche. A hard stone lay on the floor, the only thing that reminded her of rest. But even that was alien to her. Everything else, the shackles, the stairs, the cold, turned every hour into a new circle of humiliation. 2 guards stood on duty without rest, watching the prisoner. They observed every movement she made, how she ate her food, how she tried to rest, how she changed her clothes behind a thin partition. It was a system of control taken to its extreme, complete deprivation of privacy, turning the queen into an object of observation. For a woman accustomed to personal comfort and surrounded by rituals, it was worse than cold and darkness. She was deliberately broken step by step, deprived of the last thing, the feeling that she was still a human being, and not just a shadow within gray walls. No crowns or titles mattered anymore. In the conciergerie, she was not addressed by her name but by a number. And in that simple word, prisoner, lay the entire meaning of the revolution, to erase identity and leave only a shell that could be shown to the crowd. Yet even here, among the mold and the smell of prison, she held herself straight, as if the very thought of losing her composure seemed a betrayal to her. Outside, she was already called the Austrian Madame Deficit, her name printed in pamphlets and shouted in the squares. But inside this cage, behind thick walls, another story took place. The story of how a woman, deprived of everything, began to fight for what even her most merciless enemies could not take away, her inner dignity. And it was at this moment, in the silence of her cell, when the walls seemed closer than ever, that began what made her last days not only a tragedy but also a strange confirmation of strength. Crowds and tribunals waited outside, and inside the prison another center of strength appeared. Her memories of her children, her mother's grief, and her ability to endure humiliation. From there, from that damp stone cell, began the countdown in which every minute reminded her that she was no longer a queen, but simply a woman standing on the edge of the abyss. The night when the steps on the stone floor broke the sleep in the prison temple remained the most painful for her. People with torches burst into the door, bringing an order from which there was no return. They came for her 8-year-old son, the one for whom she still held on. The struggle was desperate. The mother held her child tightly, begging them not to take him. The daughter clung to her brother, screaming as if the very walls trembled from her cries. But the iron hands of the guards were stronger. The boy was torn from her as if a part of her soul had been ripped away. After that, her life was divided into before and after. From that moment, emptiness settled in her chest, which no memories or tears could fill. She would never again see his eyes or hear his voice. All that remained were tiny relics hidden inside her corset, a small portrait and a lock of hair. These little treasures became her secret refuge. Every time she touched them, she seemed to return to the world where maternal warmth still existed. And this ordeal became the hardest of all. Loss of the throne, imprisonment, humiliation. All of that was only a shell. The real blow came when the child was taken from her hands. Those who observed her in the conciergerie later said that tears appeared on her face only when she said his name. Everything else she faced with silence or with controlled pride. During those days of sorrow and loneliness, her image began to transform. In the eyes of many, she was no longer seen as a symbol of luxury, but as a woman who had been deprived of what was sacred to every mother. The crowd could scream whatever they wanted. Revolutionary newspapers could publish any accusations they wished. But behind the walls of her chamber, a different portrait appeared. Not a queen wearing a crown, but a mother from whom the most precious thing had been taken. And this image, contrary to the plans of her enemies, made her even stronger. The quiet of the cell carried the echo of that night, and each new day of her imprisonment in the conciergerie became a continuation of that pain. But it was this pain that paradoxically strengthened her. She stopped being a symbol of authority and turned into a symbol of endurance, even though she herself did not yet realize it. This internal change became the foundation upon which the main meaning of the revolution would soon unfold. A process that was planned as humiliation turned into the last arena where she was able to show her strength again. When the autumn sky over Paris became covered with clouds, the final scene began, to which she had been led for weeks. On the morning of October 14th, she was taken from her chamber and brought to the hall of the Revolutionary Tribunal. There, only the script prepared in advance was performed as a show for the public. Unlike her husband, who had time to prepare his defense, she was given only a few hours, as if, once again, a woman had no right to speak. The bench of the accused became her new stage, a flood of accusations, from political conspiracies and secret talks with Austria to fantasies about lavish feasts that turned into indecent orgies, filled the hall. In those words sounded all the hatred that had accumulated over the years. Caricatures, pamphlets, gossip, all that had poisoned her life, now turned into a state crime. But the most cruel blow was the last accusation, when the prosecutor Fouquier-Tinville spoke the words about her son, and it seemed as if the entire hall collapsed. From her 8-year-old boy, who was already under the control of the revolution, they forced a confession that she had supposedly done something shameful with him. That paper, signed by his little hand, was now turned before his mother. Silence filled the hall. She was silent for several seconds, as if the earth under her feet had disappeared. Then she rose and turned not to the judges nor to the prosecutor. Her eyes went to the rows of the gallery, where ordinary Parisian women Saturday. "I appeal to all mothers who are here," she said firmly, without trembling. This moment became a turning point. Where they wanted to erase her dignity completely, she restored it with one sentence. Women in the hall stirred. Some whispered words of sympathy. For a short moment she was no longer an Austrian, no longer Madame Deficit, but a mother defending herself and her child from a terrible slander. This moment did not change the result. The jurors' eyes remained cold, and the verdict was decided even before she entered the courtroom. But a shadow of doubt still ran across the faces of some listeners. Even those who hated her saw that she still had a warmth and a strength that no prison, no guards, and no lies could destroy. 2 days later, when the hearing ended, the decision was announced. The sentence sounded shortly, treason. She had nothing to reply. She only shook her head. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken when she turned to the mothers. Everything else had lost meaning. So she returned to her cell, not broken, but as if even more distant from everything happening around. A sheet of paper and a pen. She wrote a letter addressed to her sister, asking to forgive the boy for the words he had been forced to say. This letter never arrived. It was hidden by those who wanted to destroy every trace of her thoughts. But in those lines the last truth was felt. Her world was still her children, not the crown and not the throne. And so the trial ended in silence, which became a new form of her resistance. The morning of October 16th began with humiliation that was carefully prepared by her enemies. Guards entered the cell with an order to change her clothes. The black mourning dress she had worn after her husband's death, the last symbol of her rank and her memory of the past, had to be removed. In return, she was given a rough white shirt, not royal clothing, but a plain, humble garment of repentance. To change her clothes, she asked the guards for a moment of privacy, but even in this final hour she was denied. Then another humiliation followed. Charles-Henri Sanson and his assistants approached. One of them seized her hair, once thick, arranged in elaborate hairstyles and decorated with jewels, now temporarily whitened by the hardships of captivity. Rough scissors cut through it while still alive, slicing off the strands and leaving them in a pile on the cold stone floor. There were two meanings to this: practical, to clear the neck for the blade, and symbolic, to take away her womanhood and her former greatness. When her hands were tied behind her back, she raised her head and reminded them not to do as they had done to her husband. But her words received no answer. The ropes pressed into her wrists, causing pain, and each knot seemed to emphasize that what had been allowed to the king would now be denied to the queen. Even in the smallest things, she was refused equality. With every step of the preparation, she became less in the eyes of her enemies but greater in the eyes of history. Even the need to ask permission to relieve herself at the wall of the cell did not finally humiliate her. On the contrary, it revealed how petty were those who tried to strip her of the last remnants of dignity. And so, when the clock neared 11, the gates of the conciergerie opened. For her husband, a closed carriage had been prepared to hide his way from the people's eyes. For her, they brought a simple open cart, the kind used for thieves and murderers. She was placed on a wooden platform, her hands still bound. The crowd, waiting since early morning, shouted, jeered, and roared as if some festival had begun. The road took more than an hour. Square after square, street after street, through a sea of faces, screams, and laughter. People spat in her direction, hurled insults, and shook their fists. There was not a trace of mercy, but she sat upright, motionless, like a statue. Her face remained calm and still, and in her eyes was an emptiness stronger than hatred. That day, among the spectators was the artist David. From a balcony he watched and made quick sketches of her profile. Later, it was this very image, tired, exhausted, but proudly unbent, that became known throughout France. Even when the cart jolted violently on the cobblestones and nearly threw her from the bridge, she did not cry out. She only straightened her back higher. The crowd wanted to see her broken, but she chose the opposite, to become a motionless figure, slipping away from their celebration. And in that open cart, amid the shouting and the filth of the streets, a new myth was born, about a woman who could keep her back straight when the whole world wanted her to fall. By noon, the cart reached the Place de la Revolution. Above the city hung a heavy gray sky, and against it the wooden frame of the guillotine rose even higher, like a giant cross raised in the very heart of Paris. The crowd stirred. Thousands of voices merged into a howl that made the walls of the houses tremble. She was led out of the cart. No tent, no screen, no attempt to shield her from public view. Everything happened before all eyes. It was the final act of the performance the revolution had been preparing for months. Yet when she stepped on the ground, there was neither haste nor fear in her movements. She walked calmly, almost majestically, as if she refused to recognize the crowd's right to mock her. The scaffold stairs rose before her. The executioner's assistant extended his hand, but she drew back. She climbed the steps herself, one by one, in a white dress that now seemed less like a prisoner's shirt and more like ceremonial clothing. And there, on those steps, occurred the moment that would be remembered for centuries. When she reached the top platform, her foot accidentally stepped on the executioner's boot. At that instant, a strange silence fell, as if even the crowd had stopped breathing. She leaned toward him and spoke words no one expected to hear. "Pardon me, monsieur. I did not mean it," This brief phrase sounded louder than any scream. There was no fear or anger in it, only politeness, simple human courtesy at the most terrible moment. It was her last means to show that even here, at the edge of life, she remained herself. The enemies could take her family, her home, her throne, her name, but they could not take what was deeper, the ability to choose how to depart. The crowd, waiting for humiliation, received a spectacle of another kind. On the scaffold stood not a destroyed prisoner but a woman whose dignity became a challenge to the very idea of her enemies. And at that instant, when the blade was ready to fall, this feeling reached those who watched. They had tried to erase her, but in the end, they themselves gave her an immortal image. When the clock struck 12:15, everything was finished. The square burst out in cries of "Long live the Republic!" But among thousands of voices, an invisible echo remained. A memory of her last step, of her final phrase, of her last glance. Her body was thrown into a common pit, without a name, without a cross. It seemed that the story had ended. But in this nameless ending, the beginning of her legend was born. Because true strength sometimes appears not in the splendor of palaces, but in a single lonely moment on a wooden platform, when everything is decided by a simple phrase, "I did not mean it." From that moment on, it was no longer the revolution that determined how she would be remembered. She herself wrote her ending. The crowd dispersed, the square emptied, and her body was carried away as unceremoniously as it had been brought to the place of death. The wooden cart went not to a mausoleum or a cathedral, but to an abandoned cemetery beside the Church of the Madeleine. There were no ceremonies, no mourning speeches, no candles. Her remains were thrown into a mass grave together with the bodies of those who, during those months of the Revolution, were executed by the dozens. The last Queen of France was found in an unmarked grave, like a criminal erased from memory. It had been the main goal of her enemies not only to take her life but to remove even the memory of her existence. Yet even there the story did not end. A grim legend appeared. Shortly after the execution, a craftsman was invited to take a cast of her face. A young woman named Marie Antoinette, later known throughout the world as the creator of the famous wax museum, was reportedly commissioned to make a posthumous mask. People whispered that it was not done out of respect but to display her face as a trophy of the revolution. Thus began the long life of her image, reborn in wax. Years passed. Wars turned into treaties. The streets of Paris grew used to blood and shouting, and her fate seemed forgotten. But in 1815, when the revolution had become the past and the monarchy returned, the time came for the last page of this story. The new king, Louis XVIII, ordered that the remains of his brother and his brother's wife be taken from the earth. The task was difficult. The bones were mixed with others, and time had done its work. But step by step, carefully, as if performing a sacred rite, the remains were distinguished and gathered. And so, 20 years after her death, Marie Antoinette once again was placed beside her husband. They were reburied in the tomb of Saint Denis, the place where the kings and queens of France had rested for centuries. There, beneath heavy stone slabs, their story finally received the ending that had been taken from them on that terrible October day. Yet even after the royal burial, the legend of her did not vanish. For some, she always remained a symbol of extravagance, her name tied to waste and ruin. For others, a victim of hatred, a woman robbed of her children, her freedom, and her name. And perhaps this was the paradox of her destiny. The more they tried to erase her, the more deeply her image rooted itself in memory. She went to her death not as a radiant queen but as a prisoner in a white shirt. Yet her last words, the simple apology to the executioner, were stronger than any slogans, stronger than the cries of the mob, stronger than the blade itself. For the enemies could take her life, but they could not deprive her of her inner dignity. And it was this dignity, not the crown, that became her true legacy. Thus ended one of the most striking and tragic tales of the French monarchy. But her image, like a shadow on the walls of the conciergerie, remained alive, not in crowns or palaces, but in the memory of a woman who chose to leave with a straight back and a restrained smile, despite every humiliation. And this is how she defeated those who wanted to turn her into dust. Even after her burial in St. Denis, her image did not rest. It seemed to go on living, passing from century to century, creating new meanings, myths, and interpretations. Her story became a mirror of France itself, a nation forever wavering between glory and catastrophe, between adoration and hatred. The pamphlets of the revolutionary time portrayed her as a monster whose greed destroyed the people. Later romantics saw in her a martyr, a victim of a historic storm. Artists depicted her in a white dress like a saint. Historians debated whether she embodied royal excess or was simply a woman caught in the wrong place and time. And yet, whenever people remember her, what rises to the surface is not the brilliance of Versailles and not even the sentence of the tribunal, but that final moment upon the scaffold. Her words to the executioner echo through books and chronicles like a quiet chord capable of drowning an entire chorus of hatred. That simple apology became her strongest political act. Not planned, not calculated, but profoundly human.